Hey, Detoxer.
You are fake news.
Real motive is suppressing stories. I know there's legal, political, and scientific implications of what I just said.
What you're saying is absolutely true.
I'm a critic of Big Pharma as well. This has not been touched. Liberal professors argue against like a straw man conservative, and on conservative media, they argue against a straw man liberal. Someone who was in the CIA, what do you think of that kind of characterization?
Old fart doesn't get tech, right? I'll literally wear the t-shirt.
That's because that's what a con artist do.
So the problem with the press is you have people in the press today that don't have the gravitas of the experience to be where they are.
Help keep independent journalists like me and Nolan and others alive.
I love your writing.
Nolan, thanks as ever for what you're doing.
Hey, Detoxer.
Fake news.
Gonna go to Roku Talks right twice a day. Happy New Year, Detoxers. I was recently digging through the Epstein files, trying to get ahead of some of the theories I assumed those people on the internet would be looking for in the files. And I was specifically interested in some of the previous sex scandals, like the Franklin scandal, the Vinson scandal, the DC Madam. And I wondered if any of those types of scandals were going to be found in the Epstein files. So I did a deep dive, and what do you know? I found them all in the files, but under some really weird circumstances. To help me explain what that is, I am joined by Sydney Sullivan and our resident philosopher, Dickey. Welcome both to the Disinfo Detox.
Hello, Detoxers.
Hi, everyone. Good to be here again.
All right. So like I was saying, we'll get into what these specific scandals are. That's what I want today's show to be for folks who are not familiar with these sex scandals. I want to talk about what's true and what's false with them. But I, started doing searches in the files for these different scandals and people involved with them, and they all came up. But for the most part, they all came up within one file, and it was basically this PDF in the Epstein files that's a list of different news stories that cover these. So someone, for some reason, who had access to the DOJ's Epstein files, and of course the Department of Justice was investigating Epstein, they kept this one PDF of all these news stories talking about all these sex scandals. We should say off the bat that there's no context for the Epstein scandal. So this could be some random person who just sent this to the DOJ, like some concerned citizen who was kind of doing what I was doing, right? Seeing if these scandals were in the Epstein files, they sent it to the government. But in some cases, there actually were references to the scandals in other places, and we'll talk about those today. But I think for folks out there who maybe you're wondering, why are so many people on the internet talking about these like sex scandals? What do they have to do with Epstein? What's true about them? What's false about them? I wanted to unpack those today on the show. And so, I reached out to Sydney and Dickey to kind of help me talk about this in terms of digital culture. And much to my surprise, Dickey seems way more, in tune with sex scandals. What's up with that, Dickey?
Well, I will admit that I am a sucker for kind of trashy reality TV. So there is something that is very alluring about the scandalous details of sex scandals and whatnot. But I also think underneath that, and what's really important to focus on, is what it sort of says about the way power is conducted, how people move in circles, and what it takes to get access to influence, and how to do state crafting and world making. And I think that's very related to what's happening with Epstein, what's happening in the past, as you'll cover, from Page scandals to DC Madam to other pedophile rings. So it's just, there's this very nebulous yet consistent pattern that emerges that I think says a lot about power and sort of the ethical imperative we have towards it as members of the world together.
Yeah. And one of the things that I was sort of reminded of, and this is, I guess, a good disclaimer for the show, a lot of these scandals just sort of made news, but they've been kept alive on the internet. So that's why I wanted to cover them today, to kind of see like why. And this show is no way going to tell you 100% of the stuff in these scandals is true, but there are, pieces of evidence that do speak to the truth in some of these scandals. And that's kind of why I wanted to go through them as well. Sydney, just out of curiosity, before we jump into them, you do a lot of work in kind of digital culture. How are you seeing kind of the Epstein scandal handled in kind of these digital spaces? 'Cause I'm seeing it sort of connected everywhere I am, but what about yourself on the internet?
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of, to Dickey's point about reality TV, it was making me think a lot about like the Hunger Games, for example, where power and the way that we show and represent power, and who has it kind of comes off like a game. And I think what's very interesting about these scandals, for example, is that we've almost put it into the category or genre of something like reality TV, where it's like, oh, this is so interesting when something comes out, or oh, another piece of information that we're trying to solve, or a piece to the puzzle. But I think underneath of that is the real life implications of the people that there is impacted by this. And I think that kind of is getting pushed further and further to the side in the media world as we become more and more infatuated with like the game of unveiling or becoming interested in like these different scandals, if you will. So that's kind of how I have been seeing it take place, within like the media culture, is almost becoming this sort of like game that people are playing, or this like unveiling mystery that we're all a part of, but maybe not really understanding or rooted in the realities of the lived experiences of people that are part of this.
Yeah, and that's a good reminder too that when we're talking about the so-called Epstein files, we're recording here on New Year's and going in 2026, and the Epstein files that have been released, the most conservative estimates have it at about like 1% of all the files. The most liberal have it at like 10%, and then on top of that, the DOJ says it just found another million files that we didn't even know about, and this this happened with JFK, right? It was only last year they found, I think it was maybe about a million other files or 100,000 other files on JFK. Some odds, 50 plus years later, 60 plus years later, they find files. So we don't know a lot. And actually, before we get into one last thing on this, I've been out there talking a lot about Epstein and the media coverage of it in the podcast circuit. And it's funny. One of the things I get a lot of pushback for is I will not be as speculative as some of the other people out there. So they'll say things like, he won't go in as deep. It's like, well, we don't have the evidence. I can't say. I mean, I make a lot of guesses as to what I think are here, but 90% of the other files drop. You can look like, an idiot if they lead in a different direction or other evidence.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people on the internet, looking like an idiot is a profession. All right. So let's get into these segments here. So the first scandal we wanted to talk about was the 1983 Congressional Page Scandal. This was the year I was born. And the investigation really peaked in 1983, but the incidents occurred back in the early 1970s. And they revolved around two congresspeople, Representative Dan Crane, who was a Republican of Illinois, and Jerry Studs, who was a Democrat from Massachusetts. And the scandal basically derived around the fact that both congresspeople had admitted to having sexual relationships with 17-year-old congressional pages. These are folks who work for the congressperson, kind of like a internship type program.
The Speaker, a sad day for the House.
The pages of the House are a trust of the House, or a trust of the membership. And when you break that trust, you've done it wrong.
The charges? That Daniel Crane, Illinois conservative Republican, 3 years ago had relations with a 17-year-old female congressional page. That Gary Studs, a Massachusetts liberal Democrat, 10 years ago had sexual relations with a 17-year-old male page and made advances to two others.
Crane with a female page and Studs with a male page. And one of the things that kind of complicated this, and this sort of, I think we'll talk about this with Epstein, basically, it wasn't a legal scandal because the legal age of consent in DC at the time was 16, but it was more a discussion of kind of ethics and morality. And I think you see this with kind of some of the famous people in the Epstein files right now. It's not necessarily that we have any evidence they engaged in any illegal sexual behavior with young people, but it's the fact they're hanging around with a convicted sex offender, Jeffrey Epstein, or just being around Jeffrey Epstein while he, for no reason, has all these young girls at his house. Again, not illegal to be there, but there's some ethical ick to it. This scandal, though, was covered a little bit in the news media at the time, and in a rare move, there was some bipartisan response in Congress. They passed a censure vote on both men, which is kind of a harsh punishment back then. Today, Congress people don't really do as much work in committees, but back then they did a lot of work. So getting censured really felt like, kind of crippling your career. And this was they passed a bill that kind of changed some of the ethics around the ways in which pages were supposed to be approved and monitored. Crane eventually apologized and lost the next election. Studs refused to apologize for the nature of the relationship, calling it mutually voluntary. And although he did admit it was an error, he remained in office for another 14 years after that period went over as well. So this was kind of one of the first really mainstream ones. And I think I should point this out for historical context before I get your guys' take on this. But really prior to the 1980s and more so to the 1990s, there was this sort of belief in the press that one of the things that was off limits was people's private sex lives.
Mm.
And, obviously one of the biggest benefactors, that was probably JFK, but LBJ as well, who were having, competing with each other to have the most affairs. But the press knew about those, but they just thought you really shouldn't, report on them. And it's not really till Bill Clinton that the press gets pushed from two sides. One is the evangelical right, who's demanding this, the sanctity of marriage argument, and then this burgeoning feminist movement on the left that was demanding that these guys who are abusing their positions of power be held accountable. So this is kind of on the eve of that transition happening. So for a lot of these Congress people, they're shocked that the media is covering this at all for as little as it is. Although today it looks like basically no coverage at all. But what do you guys make of the 1983 Congressional Page Scandal?
Yeah, I actually was not familiar with this story. Which is surprising because I remember in 2006 there was another Page scandal with a Republican, Mark Foley from Florida, and I just, I remember following that and finding, being compelled by that, and so I'm surprised that it wasn't brought up, or maybe I just I didn't find it, the site might news articles or hear about it on my own. But so as I was looking into this a little bit more, of this 1983 one, I was even reading an article that came out, and I think it was in the Times, about covering the scandal, how it broke, and something that Sydney just had said previously about the sort of dignity and the integrity of the sort of victims, or the people who were abused, like that gets lost a little bit in our coverage. When I was reading this article about the New York Times, it sort of made me think a little bit about that comment. There was it sort of seemed like the whole this case was brought to the ethics committee to investigate after some pages had reported that there was widespread sexual misconduct happening. And there's a quote in this article from the head of the ethics committee, who said that that it was reprimanding these two congressmen, it was important to do because the integrity of the institution at all times must be kept at a very high plane. And I just found it interesting. There was no mention of like, oh, maybe these there's an abuse of power against these pages, these young teenage or young adults who there was, I mean, I think Studs, who was the Democrat, he was very committed to the fact that it was a voluntary relationship that he had engaged with the page, and he also, it was a homosexual relationship, which I think was a little bit controversial in the 80s. And then also I remember reading about how Studs was very critical of the U.S. Government policy in Latin America, and was not, a fan of supplying, arms and support to like the Contras. And so I was like, oh, maybe he was just an expendable person that you could throw under the bus, protect the integrity of the institution of Congress, and not really actually look at the abuse of power that's happening, and not really dig deeper and look at the systemic stuff, the structural stuff, and just.
And for folks who don't remember, the Iran-Contra scandal happened during the Reagan administration, and Congress had told Reagan it was illegal to send arms to the Contras down in Nicaragua. Well, they weren't in Nicaragua, but Nicaragua exiles. And he did anyways, and he was able to fund that by illegally sending arms to Iran through Israel in exchange for releasing hostages, while Iran was fighting Iraq, who we had also helped arm at the same time. And then this exploded into this big scandal. And so it was a big embarrassment for the Reagan administration and the United States. And so that's why I think you're right to point that out. I want to come back to Mark Foley because I totally forgot about that. But Sydney, did you have something you want to say on this?
Oh, I was just going to say, like, the irony is not lost on me that, like, the left and right would come together to, like, agree that we need to have more clear ethical standards and then argue over, like, fake news and what is and is not true. So I just have found that to be really ironic in all of this, is the fact that we were able to come together over something like as important as we need to have more clear ethical boundaries about the expectations of the people that we put in office. But then we come around years later and now it's more, well, whose truth is right and what news is real and what is fake. So that has become like a very interesting part to me about these two sides.
Yeah, we saw that happen out of the Epstein scandal as well, because Representative Plaskett from Virgin Islands, she got busted in the Epstein files that she was live communicating with Epstein to while she was interrogating the president's lawyer. I'm blanking on his name right now, in a congressional hearing. And during that congressional hearing, she's live tweeting with Epstein. And so this came out in the Epstein files, and they were going to go after her. At the same time, Republicans were worried that there was a congressman that was being targeted as well, named Representative Corey Mills, who, if you guys haven't checked him out, he's quite the character. This guy had all these girlfriends on the side. He was abusive. He was trying to force them into sex. And he was facing censure as well. Basically, both parties made a backroom agreement that they wouldn't censure either members of the other team, and both got away with this, much to the chagrin of a lot of women Republicans in Congress have spoke out against that. So Sydney, you're right about that. Dickey, can you explain the Mark Foley scandal? Because it happened in 2006, but it's an interesting connection you made there.
Yeah, I mean, at the sort of over, I don't know all the details, but essentially what I recall is Mark Foley was a very, conservative Florida Republican, senator, I believe, I can't remember if he was a congressman or senator, but from Florida, Republican, very,
He was a Republican congressman.
Congressman, okay, yeah, and just was, ironically, anti-gay, did not support gay marriage, and then is caught emailing and texting. I don't know the exact age, but they were young, page boys that worked in his office, and there was not any evidence to pursue a that he did something illegal, but ethically it was a very bad look, and I believe he stepped down from that. But it was right around the time that gay marriage was kind of the big political football, and it had yet to really start passing, and state by state, and well before the Supreme Court ruling. And so it was just it was on many fronts, like it exposed the hypocrisy of our elected leaders, and that there is something that happens when people in power get into power, and there's an abuse that happens of their power, and then and we can probably explore this more as we get into or if we do get into Epstein, but this idea that pathologically something happens to your soul and your mind when you start gaining influence and power, and you just start seeing people as playthings to use, and kind of pushing the bounds of what's permissible, and kind of getting a thrill from stepping into the forbidden. That's the only way you feel that you're alive. I don't know. I think that there is this that's kind of the ethical imperative I feel about power, like how we have to kind of put a check on power, because it can really corrupt not just, in a greed sense, but when it comes to the spirit and of what we do to each other.
Well,
And
and
the
sorry, I was going to say to your point too, like not only do people feel more powerful, but I think other people give them power too. Like society gives people more power to act in certain ways because it's not as if you were to tell someone that your best friend was a rapist that people would love that person. But all of a sudden you say a congressman is, and people are like, well, are they really? And so it really is, I feel that people are more willing to bend the rules for people who do have power and influence, or they're more willing to, at the very least, turn a blind eye to it.
Yeah, gosh, we could do a whole show on these Congress folks who run an anti-gay agenda and then come out as gay. At the same time that Foley went down, Larry Craig, remember, who was the family values anti-gay senator, got caught soliciting a gay prostitute in an airport bathroom. So if you folks want to know more about that, there's a great documentary from that period called Outrage on HBO, which covers all these different guys and how they got caught. But speaking, I think with this theme of power, the next story is interesting because it has a kind of murder mystery attached to it. So right after the Page scandal in the late 80s, we get the so-called Franklin Network, and it's tied to this disappearance of Johnny Ghosh, although the connection has never really been proven, but in the minds of a lot of people online, there's a connection. And the Franklin Network scandal is often cited as the so-called Rosetta Stone of people trying to understand the Epstein case, because of the specific kind of high-level intersection between finance and exploitation. And it took place between 1988 and 1991, largely in Omaha, Nebraska. And it centers around a guy named Lawrence King, who was a really powerful Republican figure who, just side fact, sang the national anthem at the 1984 Republican National Convention. And he lived a double life. By day, he was kind of this high-flying power broker amongst the political elite. And then by night, he was an alleged ringleader of this kind of massive child sex trafficking network. And this double life kind of came to a fruition in a strange sort of way. And this maybe speaks to Dickey's point about who gets targeted and who doesn't. But he had a credit union that was raided in November of 1988. And the investigation all of a sudden took a dark turn, meaning that investigators started to realize that this wasn't just about embezzling $39 million, which he admitted to, by the way, later on. But as they dug into that money, they started to see these connections that brought more and more victims or survivors coming forward. And the law enforcement concluded that King was running these lavish parties where minors, children, were abused. And the children who were kind of preyed upon were in the foster care system. And they were often flown to the East Coast for these kind of high-level parties where they were being sexually abused by politicians. And he was seen as the facilitator, basically getting these massive amounts of money to run this scandal. When this went to the courts in 1990, both state and federal grand juries dismissed the abuse allegations as, quote, carefully crafted hoaxes. They even jailed one of the accusers, who I'm not going to name her, but that's up for a different day. However, there was counter evidence to kind of undermine the hoax label. One witness won a civil suit against King for abuse, so the courts at least found that allegation accurate. And the lead investigator for the Nebraska legislator, Gary Cardori, he died in a mysterious plane crash in 1990, just as he was reportedly closing in on evidence about the ring. So this is what feeds a lot of the conspiracy online. But interestingly, one of the senators, Senator John DeCamp, he also referred to it as a cover-up, and he wrote a whole book about how the allegations were real, and there was this cover-up in Washington, D.C. about it. So I'll get to the connection with Johnny Ghosh here, Johnny Ghosh in a second. But what did you guys make of this scandal?
Yeah, I mean, it really, I see the, I think when I was making my last point about the level that of like being a billionaire or being a power broker, and when you start abusing children in a foster care system, it just, yeah, it really speaks to like the evil that can that just becomes available to someone who's just it's the power that they have, the money, the influence, as Sydney said, the sort of like people around them enable them. But yeah, you just it's pathologically damaging to people, and it's kind of one of the many reasons why I think billionaires shouldn't exist, is that we would have less of this happening. And it and yeah, I knew a little bit about this from a documentary I saw like almost a decade ago about Johnny, who took Johnny, I think it's
Mhm.
called, that kind of touched on this. And
Let me let me get into that then. So kind of correct me if I'm wrong on this, but like the belief is that there really is this child who disappeared named Johnny Ghosh, and I'll get into his story here in a second. But the belief is that the ways in which these foster care systems, because remember, this is pre-DNA era. Well, I mean, DNA existed, but pre being able to test for it, they were able to kidnap children across the country, put them into this foster care system, and then take them from the foster care system into this sex ring. That was sort of the theory about how Johnny Ghosh fits in. And so the Franklin investigation, when it emerged, people went back to this kid who disappeared in 1982 named Johnny Ghosh, who at the time was a 12-year-old paper boy from Iowa. And he's remembered because he was one of the first children who was really put on milk cartons. And for the younger members of our audience, missing children were put on milk cartons. The idea is that everybody would have milk one way or another in the morning with their coffee or cereal, and you would see the missing child. And because everybody saw that face, it was more likely that if you saw that child on the street, you'd be able to identify their location. And there's a lot of bias into which children they chose, and we can talk about that another day. But so the scandal, there was this belief that Johnny Ghosh was kidnapped as part of the Franklin scandal. There was no real evidence at the time to say that was true. But then something kind of weird happened in the story, which is in 1997, his mother claims that Johnny returned, now 27 years old, and visited her at about 2:30 in the morning. And she said she knew it was her son because he showed a birthmark he had on his body that only a mother would know. And he had shown up with some guy who he didn't tell his mom who this person was. And he told his mom he had been a part of a pedophile organization, but had to live under an assumed identity to keep his own safety. She said the man seemed to be really intimidating, and she thought Johnny seemed brainwashed or fearful, as he was constantly looking at the unidentified man, like looking for approval to speak. And she told this kind of story, and it was largely disregarded by a lot of folks, but not her I think they were divorced, maybe not, but her husband, Johnny's father, one way or another, he believed it, and he said that as well. And then like years later, over a decade later, she then claimed that she found photos left on her doorstep depicting boys bound and gagged. And one of them she thought was Johnny. Now, these photos were said to actually have taken place before Johnny got kidnapped. Some people said they were of boys in Florida in 1978 and 1979. But interestingly, law enforcement identified all the boys in the picture except the one that the mom claimed was Johnny. And this has, I think the salacious and complicated details of the story, and plus, I think hopefully the empathy anyone feels for a mother, that kind of kept the Johnny story alive. And because of its connection to Franklin, it kept Franklin alive as well. Obviously, the parallels here with assuming this was all true, the parallels with the Epstein story are very clear, and I think you can see naturally why, if you believe the details of the Franklin scandal, you kind of already have a sort of fixed narrative about what the Epstein case is going to be as well, right? They fit pretty well together. The fact that it's these young people being either forced or coerced into sexual service that's then being loaned out and used for people in high positions of power. That's why it's called kind of the Rosetta Stone of the Epstein story. So, and just one last detail on that before I get your guys' take. Obviously, the Lawrence King, who was supposedly running this ring, he's a very wealthy man. And this is where folks think it's not just about selling bodies. it's also about blackmail. So if you get these Congress people in situations with young children, and then you can document it, you can use it as leverage against them to control their agenda in Congress, or to extract money from like wealthy bankers who might have their careers ruined or whatever it may be, right? International blackmail is one of the theories on Epstein. And that's supported by the idea that it's well documented now, and you can see this from the pictures. Epstein monitored his entire house and all of his homes, every room. So if people were engaged in sex acts, illegal or otherwise, they would be able to be documented, which means they then could be used as leverage. And we can get into some of the claims of where that leverage was used. But what do you guys make of the kind of Franklin story and how it fits into the larger Epstein online community?
Yeah, I feel like, and I might be going on a like social media and well-being rant here, so feel free to stop me if I get off track. But I think for me, I think the reason Epstein has become so adamant for so many people is that there is just so much tied to emotion in a lot of these stories, and especially like when I was reading this particular scandal, I was thinking about like all the ways in which we hold so much weight around like unresolved grief or silence on certain stories. And I think a lot of people bring in that grief or that like unresolved tension into looking at the Epstein cases or looking at similar cases. And I also think that like the difficulty of that, even though that's a very real resonating feeling, is that it also is where a lot of issues come from when it comes to arguing with different political sides about what we believe, because we're so emotionally tied to the stories and the information we're getting. It's very difficult to disperse those things and become more logical in the conversations that we're having with different political parties online. It's something I think about a lot when it comes to social media, is the ways in which it does a really good job of driving us apart from one another and having logical conversations, because it is so emotionally rooted and driven, and gets us really enraged really quickly. So that's something I think about when I hear this story, is just the ways that we can so easily fall into patterns of like grief and sorrow, and like really resonating with these people, because these are very, very real things and feelings and intense emotions. But it does make me, again, think a lot about how those emotions a lot of times are used to drive parties apart and drive logical arguments apart, rather than bringing us together to talk about a topic.
Yeah, and the on the blackmail side of it as well. This is something that really is an important part of the Epstein case. I don't think gets enough attention. That a lot of people online think the sexual acts were used as blackmail historically. Like one of the examples they give, and again, this is not proven. I don't want to be like the people I'm criticizing here, but like with Bill Clinton, they claim that like Israel gave him a heads up that they knew about the Lewinsky scandal before the U.S. did, and they used that as leverage for him not to seek a two-state solution in those negotiations while he was president between Israel and Palestine. Or even just shortly thereafter, Ross Perot ran an insurgent campaign where he was beating both the Democrats and Republicans in the polls for president. Then he suddenly like drops out, and he claimed that someone had intelligence on his daughter. And they, so folks think that was part of like maybe this sort of blackmail campaign of how people in power use blackmail to control politicians. And the Franklin scandal, I think, at least shows the possibility of someone who could do it, right? If it was true. And I think that fits into the Epstein narrative as well.
Yeah, I feel like in with the blackmail that there's also this kind of soft implicit blackmail that's happening too, where even people who are not implicated in a sex crime with a minor, um whether it's Epstein and his circle of friends or in the Franklin scandal, these people who are power brokers, who get things done, who raise money, who host an RNC, everyone is kind of, even when they turn their eye away, they let it happen. They say, oh, you're a creep. I don't want to partake, but you do things for me that still makes them complicit. Like if yeah, like there's this you're sort of vulnerable to someone like Epstein, exploiting the fact that he knows he can use your silence against you in a sense. Like, it's not maybe you're not implicated, you're not recorded, you don't have there's no smoking gun of you doing something terrible, but just just by kind of turning a blind eye and remaining connected, that's enough to keep you quiet or kind of influence you behind the scenes.
And as we talk about this next scandal, I think it's a good addition to add here, that there has been a lot of research by folks like Aaron Good and Whitney Webb, who talk about the how the intelligence community in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s began working with organized crime as ways to get dirt on people off the books. And they have some of these. There's an allegation, for example, like the CIA had images of then director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, engaged in homosexual acts with Tolbert Vinson, and Agent Tolbert, and they had used this as leverage to control Hoover. So there are these sort of documented cases in history of blackmail in government as well. And that plays into kind of the next scandal, where a lot of these sort of stories start to tie together. And this scandal is known as the Vinson scandal or the Ebony and Ivory brothel scandal. And this was in 1989. So this is happening in the midst of the Franklin scandal. And it really focused on this guy named Craig Spence, who was a high society lobbyist, a former ABC correspondent, and was supposedly known as a fixer for Japanese interests. And Spence was outed by the Washington Times as a primary client of a male escort service run by a guy named Henry Vinson. And Vinson was a funeral parlor owner and supposedly used that funeral parlor to launder money. And his client list included key officials from the Reagan and Bush administration. And so Spence was supposedly spending upwards of $20,000 a month on these sex services. And they included midnight tours as well of the White House.
And if Washington doesn't have enough to talk about these days, the Washington Times reported today that unidentified White House aides in the Carter, Reagan, and Bush administrations now are being investigated for using the services of a call boy ring.
This is one of the most kind of, surreal parts of the entire story. Spence didn't just hire escorts. He took them on private late night tours of the White House. This is obviously a security breach. And this is during the Cold War, right, when it's supposedly like the highest standards of security. It's alleged that White House guards reportedly, under orders from top level persons, waved Spence and his male prostitutes through the gates in the middle of the night. And some of the reporting tied this to the intelligence community, arguing that Spence hinted that these tours were arranged by Donald Gregg, who was then Vice President George H.W. Bush's national security advisor. It should also be noted that George H.W. Bush was head of the CIA before he was the vice president as well. And Spence claimed his homes were bugged for clandestine surveillance by friendly CIA agents to help him gather leverage. So the kind of allegations about Epstein being this sort of blackmail spy using sex acts as leverage, that really emerged with Spence first. And there's a crossover here between this scandal and the Franklin scandal, which we just talked about, where they call it a so-called honey trap, which is where you have these kind of two-way mirrors and hidden cameras to record powerful guests engaged in these sex acts. So the Franklin scandal was obviously the first one that we mentioned as well. And the callboy scandal, it's not really known if that was connected. I don't know many folks who make that connected to the honeypot part of it. But this one, because of Craig Spence's comments, was believed to be part of these so-called honey traps. And these honey traps, are not new. Like the CIA, declassified files from the CIA show that the CIA was doing this in the mid 20th century. It was called Operation Midnight Climax. And they would get these people into rooms, and the sex worker would like go in the bathroom, and they would have little spray in the air that would spray like LSD. and they would use that to kind of get them, they believed it was a truth serum too. They'd get them kind of off edge and engage in these sex acts that could be used for blackmail or truth telling. But Craig Spence, this is happening after that. And as the Department of Justice and Secret Service began, really taking the Vinson scandal seriously, it ended with like a bunch of kind of tragic and murky events, the most important of which was the death of Craig Spence, who died on November 10th, 1989. He was found dead in a barricaded room at the Boston Ritz-Carlton, and people thought this scene looked staged. He was dressed in a full tuxedo with white suspenders. He was found with a telephone receiver cradled to his ear, wearing a Walkman, playing Mozart. And the message written in black felt tip marker on the bathroom mirror was, quote, "Chief, consider this my resignation. Life is duty. God bless America." Now, hidden in the room was a newspaper clipping about protecting CIA agents from testifying before government agencies. And supposedly the big reveal about this is Spence had told journalists that the prostitution ring was insignificant compared to other things he had done. He told his friend Liz Trotta, reportedly, that the authorities would never be able to solve the big thing. His death was ultimately ruled a suicide by overdose. But many, especially those in the Epstein community, believe there is a lot more here. I want to get your take on the scandal, but before I do, the media's treatment of Craig Spence and Vinson was what some people call kind of a study in scandal containment. It was front page news, so you can't say it wasn't covered, but it kind of went through this cycle that we see a lot. There's an explosive beginning where the details are coming out. Major outlets like New York Times, LA Times, Associated Press are covering it, and they focus on like the midnight tours aspect of it. And so it's not about like the larger question of power, which, both of you keep bringing up, and I think rightfully so. And then it kind of pivots to like the eccentricity. So as it became clear that like Spence had ties to the CIA and high level figures like Donald Gregg, the media narrative kind of shifted, and journalists started focusing on Spence's like flamboyant personality and lavish lifestyle. The person becomes the story. And I think we saw this with Epstein as well. And then, of course, it ultimately ends with the suicide. The suicide closes the story, but, regardless of whether or not Craig Spence was part of some blackmail ring, he had to have a lot of help to be able to procure these individuals and procure access to the White House. There's still like a scandal there. But with his death, the media's interest in the scandal seems to die with it. So what do you guys make of kind of the Vincent scandal and Craig Spence?
Yeah, I hadn't heard of Craig Spence, but I couldn't, when I was reading about him and reading some articles, it just was wild how many parallels I was finding to Epstein, that story of Epstein, as well as the coverage, which you've touched on a little bit, Nolan, but just, reading articles that, literally are calling Spence like really honing in on him being a theater major and that he's eccentric and scandalous and you can't believe anything he says. And even the sort of ragging on the, I think it was the Washington Times that published the story on the Ivory Ebony brothel and had mentioned, in the one I read, it didn't mention Spence by name, but it alluded to him. But the Washington Post coverage of the Washington Times story was trying to paint the Washington Times as sort of this rag, like a yellow journalism, and they do that journalism, but this is the real journalism. And recently, like the New York Times, who even they've been publishing articles about Jeffrey Epstein to say, there's not much to see here. He was kind of he screwed over a lot of people, and he had this like sex ring that was lucrative, but when you actually start looking into the emails, which, by the way, I think maybe we can give a link to Jmail, which is a sort of Gmail-esque archive of all of these email dumps that some really heroes, in a sense, of putting their time and effort into making that happen.
And they go beyond the DOJ files. So the DOJ files are some of the files, but the Epstein estate has also released files, and there are other files out there. And Jmail puts all those together, so you can find actually all of the known Epstein files that are available in one area. Go ahead.
Exactly, and you see that it's not just about organizing parties. Like Jeffrey Epstein is literally creating, foreign policy, is making the world, is installing mass surveillance in Cote d'Ivoire or in Mongolia, and so. The New York Times trying to diminish what's actually happening. Kind of this, the sex trafficking is part of the story for sure. But that there's something much more uh kind of something much deeper that's happening underneath this, which is just transnational elite networks of power happening, and Jeffrey Epstein's kind of at the center. But a little getting a little off the path here, but I just found that that Spence is kind of like an Epstein-esque character, maybe not as to the exact extreme that Epstein was, but definitely someone who, if you hung out with, you had access to diplomats or other influential people in the elite circles, and that if you wanted to be invited to the parties, you had to kind of put up with the sort of controversial things that were happening or that he was involved in, and that's a way to filter out people who that's how you kind of get the enablers around you, I think so.
Mhm. I was just thinking, Nolan, about what you said in terms of like the fact that this news was covered, but the way that it was covered was it's just, to me, when I think about writing in general, and I think about like the rhetorical situation, like as a writer, your purpose is always very clear. You should always have a purpose and you should always have an audience. And to think that like people wrote these pieces with an audience in mind of like a general public, but then the purpose of this, like how they were framing this entire scandal, just becomes really interesting. Like, what was the purpose of writing a piece in which the center point, to your point, Dickey, was like who this person was, or like the fact that they're a theater major? Like, why are these the things that we're fixated on or focused on? Like, what is the actual message behind this piece? And I think that is something that's like a really key thing to look at when you're focusing in on something like a scandal. And if you parallel it to Epstein, like there is a lot of information that comes out from kind of major news sources where you look at the information and the way that it's presented can very easily change your perception or how you're interpreting the message. But I think what's important is taking note of that as a reader and saying like, okay, like what was the author's like intention in me reading this? And then what is my like actual interpretation of this message? Because I feel like there are a lot of ways in which people report on things, but it's just kind of getting the news out there.
Yeah, and on that point, I think it's worth noting. There's a kind of a charitable and uncharitable interpretation of why journalists like fail, and I'll give you an example in this with like Dana Bash. Dana Bash was interviewing Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, pointed out that in the emails there's a lot of evidence that Dickey just cited, pointing to the fact that Epstein was working for like international intelligence, particularly for Israel when it came to some of these like deals with Mongolia and elsewhere. And Bash's response right away was, "What evidence do you have for that?"
Mhm.
And the evidence was right. Marjorie Taylor Greene just said what the evidence was in that same interview. And like, this was a thing that drove a lot of us nuts. And this is kind of where you get the charitable or uncharitable interpretation. The charitable interpretation for me is, I talk to a lot of journalists. A lot of them don't know history. They don't know context. They come to these stories out of nowhere. And the field actually prefers that. They think it's like a fresh perspective if you come to it with no prior knowledge. And that's true in some regard. But in another regard, you come in like with no context. If you don't have the right sources, you're just an ahistorical interview, right? And I think this happens a lot with kind of like Epstein. They focus on the salacious details, right? Like Bill Clinton was in a hot tub. Oh, let's talk about that. The non-charitable interpretation, though, is there is also a long history of members of the press knowingly working on behalf of people in power, and you can see this in the Epstein files. In fact, Michael Wolff, for example, is tied to Jeffrey Epstein. Michael Wolff's a very influential journalist who's working with Epstein. I wouldn't call him a journalist, but Steve Bannon's a media personality who puts out content, who's working closely with Epstein. But more historically, you can go back to the CIA in the 1960s had Operation Mockingbird, where they were paying journalists to write U.S. friendly stories. You can go to 2008 at the end of the Bush administration. It was noted that the Pentagon was putting spokespeople on TV to give a pro-war message, and media were hosting these folks. And Cy Hirsch, who's a famous journalist, has complained about this for a long time. So it's not to say that I think every journalist is co-opted, but some are charitably just ignorant and write this kind of nonsense. As you point out, Sydney, it's also another motive is it furthers your career. The stuff that talks about sex is going to get clicks. If you talk about a complex international scandal that goes back to the 1980s when most people weren't alive, you're going to get a lot of like Z's. People are going to snore. And so there's that aspect. But then there are folks who, yeah, we have a long history of documenting folks who've lied for people in power in the press. So I think to your point, you got to kind of not only know the content you're looking at, but you also have to know the person and outlet writing it. Like, do they have a history of spreading propaganda or not?
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think it's also just really important to remember that mainstream media often are these huge conglomerates, and they are, they have shared interests with the sort of corporate power that is in that runs government, that sort of runs the shadowy operators, and that the mainstream media, it's not even like the individual reporters would not be at that agency if they thought to ask different questions. The reason they have their jobs, whether they know it or not, is really is because they it's sort of the default to align more with power. And this is I'm doing a terrible job of paraphrasing, but I know that George Orwell, I think it was called The Literacy of Censorship or something, talks about how like a reporter would not be having their job at a news agency if they knew how to ask probing questions. So yeah, it's important to think of that.
I hate to bring him up because of what's been done to his reputation with the Epstein files, but Chomsky
yes,
has
and
a famous
brought this up.
As a famous moment with a journalist in the 70s where this journalist said, "We're not censored," or maybe the 80s, "We're not censored. We can say whatever we want." And Chomsky's like, "If you said what they didn't want you to say, you wouldn't have this job."
Exactly. Yeah. And I think he was riffing off of George Orwell. Yeah, it's interesting. I can put a pin in it, but I have so many thoughts about Chomsky that I'd love to ask you, Nolan, at some point, maybe later at the end or one-on-one. But yeah,
we can talk about some Chomsky. It's let's talk about we'll get to Chomsky here at the end. Okay, so for folks who are wondering why we're skipping the 1990s, we kind of mentioned the Ross Perot scandal or Monica Lewinsky, but at least in like internet lore, those aren't tied to the Epstein scandal. Again, none of this may be tied to the Epstein scandal at all. We're just talking about what people on the internet tie to the Epstein scandal and giving you a peek behind the curtain. And also, I think we all as a country and a world probably owe Monica Lewinsky less attention and more apologies. So we'll move here to the early 2000s. This one, I remember this scandal, and I did a deeper dive for this show, and I've really forgot, or I guess didn't remember that it was tied to the Epstein scandal. So this is about Jeff Gannon, the Jeff Gannon affair, aka the press pass escort, and this is happening in 2003 to 2005, and it focuses around this guy named Jeff Gannon, who was born under the name James Guckert.
There is another controversy brewing tonight. This one involves the Bush administration and the news media. It is the talk of Washington these days. It involves a man who was a regular in the White House press briefing room. He was free to ask President Bush and his press secretary questions on a regular basis, but it turns out he wasn't really a journalist and wasn't using his real name. And there is more to his past that is making a lot of people wonder what he was doing in the White House in the first place.
And he was a conservative columnist for this online news organization called Talon News. And Gannon became kind of a household name because, this is going to sound weird. Maybe this was just me. But after 9/11, cable news got so much attention. We were glued to our TVs. For folks who don't remember, the kind of Web 2.0, the social media internet had not developed yet. So there's plenty of people on the internet, but we were really glued to our TVs and we'd watch these press conferences every day. So like these, for at least folks of my generation, these politicians and journalists became like household names because we would watch every day to see like how many terrorists did we catch? Is there a new threat? Are we going to war with a new country? Will George W. Bush misspell something important? It was all the big scandals. And Gannon was one of these reporters in the press corps. And he became known for asking George W. Bush almost these like laughable softball questions. Like I have to imagine like Stephen Colbert's conservative character was based off Jeff Gannon. It was like comedic, the softball questions. And he would not only ask softball questions, he would mock Democrats, like saying things like they were, quote, divorced from reality. And as a result, the media did something it rarely does. It investigates itself. And let me just note that, and I've had this fight with journalists for years. I understand it, so don't send me hate mail again. But the press thinks that if they have make themselves the story, they have failed as an organization. So they typically do not report on themselves because they think that's like a failure of the press. And so when you have press scandals, it has to usually tie to like press ownership or something like that to get them involved. Journalists themselves committing errors is not something they report on. But that changed with the Gannon scandal, because basically there's this media investigation into who Jeff Gannon is, and it was online bloggers, believe it or not, who quickly discovered Gannon had no journalistic background. And actually his day job was he was a $200 an hour, this was his title, gay escort, advertised himself on a website called hotmilitarystud.com. I did not check if that is still open, but users and detoxers, you can take a look. And this basically was a security breach because, and this is kind of where it echoes Craig Spence in terms of, is this an individual who was able to wiggle his way into power, or is this someone who was helped by power to get this kind of access? Because despite having no credentials and using an alias, and again, this is during post 9/11 world when we're all freaked out that there's an attack coming any minute and everybody is suspect, he was able to get these daily passes to the White House for 2 years. The news agency he supposedly worked for had no physical office. It was just a virtual site owned by a Republican affiliated group. So many suspected that it was created just to give Gannon a cover in the press room. And so while, established journalists often waited like weeks for clearance, Gannon was just waved in hundreds of times. And this kind of spoke, just like Craig Spence, this non-journalist with high-level access, whose real identity was making money on the side doing something else, was given access by the Secret Service. And Gannon was tied to some interesting scandals. One was the Plame connection. So he was involved in a series of intelligence leaks, the most famous of which was that of Valerie Plame. And basically, she was a CIA officer who was doing research for the CIA that essentially was showing that the White House was lying. Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction, and the public was being lied to. And in the process of this investigation, she was outed by the press. And Gannon had his hands on the internal government memos about Plame. Later came out that the leak came from the vice president's office, which was Dick Cheney. But Dick Cheney's number two, Scooter Libby, ultimately went down for the crime. So he somehow had access to that. And just by the way, under George H.W. Bush was the one at the CIA and time as vice president who made it a crime to out a CIA agent that was punishable by death. So this isn't just like a salacious reveal. This is a crime punishable by death that they were engaged in with Gannon, who was not a journalist. So it's giving high sensitive information to someone who is not even a journalist, which is protected by the First Amendment. Now, here's where it kind of gets interesting. Now, Henry Vinson, who we talked about in that previous scandal, who ran the brothel at the center of the Craig Spence scandal, he claimed that a high-level source had one time recommended a specific young man to him years earlier, a man from Pennsylvania named James Guckert. And that's the real name of Jeff Gannon. And so Vinson at least claims that, Gannon was somewhat in his orbit as well. When the media focused on Gannon in 2005, they largely treated it as like a phenomenon of just like, how did this random person get into the White House? The media largely ignored his connections because it would have required them to admit, you know, go back to the Vinson story, go back to Spence and all those kinds of things. And it may have, you know, pointed to the fact that Gannon had help. And again, this was in the midst of 9/11, and just even like speaking out against the president got people in trouble. Like Michael Moore, we remember, was ostracized for that in 2004. The Dixie Chicks had like their CDs like ran over because she dared to say she was embarrassed by the president of the United States. So coming out and reporting that the White House might be part of this propaganda campaign, controlling the press, or even worse, be part of this like larger sex scandal, that was just not, nobody who wanted to have a career in news media was going to do that in 2003, 2004. Gannon, the news media literally refused to really talk about Gannon's case too much far after. He was barely ever mentioned or guckered in any of these White House links. And so the door just kind of closed on that scandal. What do you guys make of the Jeff Gannon, James Guckert scandal of the White House press corps?
Yeah, this was an interesting kind of learning the. I mean, I never heard of Jeff Gannon, but I do remember the Valerie Plame scandal, and so learning sort of the ins and outs more intricately about that was compelling. And when I was thinking about this, reading about it, it just made me think about the usefulness of these operators. You know, like, I mean, Gannon, it's not like an Epstein character at all, but that he was, or you know, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, I don't know. But what I was really thinking about was how his role that he played was a sort of a useful idiot in a sense, like for the administration that was in power, the Bush administration. And you know, with like asking certain questions that are very softball, or even being involved in the leaking of Valerie Plame's name. It was you know, it was an easy person to use, and then also an easy person to kind of take the fall. Or, you know, I guess Scooter Libby, you know, sort of took the fall in a sense, but it was very much minimized. But yeah, I just like the usefulness of a Jeffrey Epstein character is much different, but he also played a role in working in the shadows and delivering on what you need done, but sort of in a back channel way, or making sure it's off the books. Yeah, I don't. That was sort of my thinking around this.
Dickey, is that the CIA coming behind you?
Yes, sorry. Trash people.
That's funny. I know my trash came earlier, so we just missed that. I think when I think about this particular scandal, I just think about kind of like this repeated vulnerability that was happening within institutions. I think that that's something that is really important as we're looking at something like this, is just the kind of attention that gets turned away from this vulnerability that was happening, and how we're not really paying attention to that as much. And again, it kind of reminds me of some of the other scandals in which like we're paying more attention to these individual people and maybe like what they're like or their backstory, rather than the issue of like the institution itself is being repeatedly kind of either, whether it's like hacked or it's let into, or whatever it may be. And especially in a time, Nolan, as you're saying, like context is so important here, like especially at a time where we are vulnerable in a sense, like to have this like continuously happening, I think is important when we're looking at stories like this. So I think that's the thing that's coming up for me a lot, is just the, again, framing of, we're looking at this person, but really we're not paying as much attention to this repeated vulnerability that was happening.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the things I wanted to, and I'm glad you said that. I was hoping to illustrate with the show. Like, and as I keep pointing out, there's so much other nonsense associated with these so-called scandals that is not true. But just the stuff that is true, to me, it's amazing how it repeats over and over again. Whether it just be breaches of the White House, or the corruption of members of the press, or the press reducing a story to an individual versus like larger context. Like, those are the lessons, like, I would hope that people would take away from these scandals. The larger kind of Epstein story is interesting, and I highly encourage all researchers to keep looking into it and find evidence to help us understand what happens. But I think you're right, Sydney. Like, that's really the important kind of takeaway here. Now, the next story, this is the one. So far, we've talked about stories where I've been alive for all these stories, but and heard to a degree. But the next story is the one that, like, I really first remember following very closely, which was the DC Madam story. And the DC Madam story happened between 2004 and 2008 in terms of news media coverage, but it had been operating for about the 13 years prior. So it overlaps with a lot of these other stories we're hearing. And the major player in this is Deborah Palfrey, who is known as the so-called DC Madam, criminal justice graduate and former paralegal. She, admitted to running a high-end escort agency that cleared over $2 million and catering to Washington elites. So in Washington, D.C., the elites are reaching out to Palfrey. She claimed to have a phone log of 10,000 to 15,000 clients. And unlike previous scandals, she didn't hint at names. She actually released the records. And this is going to be, I think, this is where the Epstein people are going to get excited. So this is this is a really pivotal move for showing how information is protected. So Palfrey handed over supposedly 46 pounds of phone records to ABC News, and ABC concluded that almost none of the clients were newsworthy. And that's really interesting. 46 pounds of documents, none of them are newsworthy. Only a few names ended up getting released. Senator David Vitter of Louisiana was probably the most famous. Randall Tobias, a former deputy secretary of state, who eventually ended up resigning after this was all over. I should say Vitter did acknowledge and apologize for his involvement, but remained in office for years afterward. Harlan K. Ullman was a high-level military strategist and author who was also implicated. He was a part of the sort of shock and awe doctrine, which was the outline of the George W. Bush's plan in Iraq. Palfrey specifically named him in court documents as a regular client. One of the ones that really is pervaded on the internet, and I remember this at the time, was then Vice President Dick Cheney. Rumors regarding Cheney began circulating largely due to a combination of Palfrey's public statements and specific investigation threads by journalists. So in 2007, there was a blog that published a story claiming that Cheney's name was on the phone list. This was never corroborated by mainstream outlets or the Department of Justice, but it set the internet on fire. And it was largely regarded because Palfrey had teased in interviews that her list contained, quote, someone very high up in the executive branch. And because Cheney was such a powerful and polarizing figure at the time, he became kind of a primary target of speculation. But here's where I think it feeds into kind of Epstein's interests or interest in the Epstein case. To this day, the thousands of names in that list have been protected by court orders. In 2016, Palfrey's former attorney, Montgomery Blair Sibley, attempted to release the records, claiming they were relevant to the presidential election of that year. But the U.S. Supreme Court denied the requests, keeping the Madam's secrets under seal. Now, remember, I know everybody's going to think, oh, that must mean Donald Trump was in her book. He was running against Hillary Clinton, and her husband was the former president, and a lot of people in her staff were also part of the Clinton administration. So it could very well have been against like the Clintons at some level, or Trump, or both, or neither, for all we know, because they weren't released. But also another reason why it posts interest, because just like the Craig Spence scandal and Epstein, the DC Madam scandal is defined by a trail of bodies that many find difficult to accept as mere coincidence. So to understand what I mean by this, we have to go to another figure in the story, which is Brandy Britton. And Brandy Britton died in 2007, so shortly before this scandal. And she was one of the former employees, supposedly, of Palfrey, who was found dead. Now, Britton was a sociology professor with a PhD who had brought in 1.5 million in NIH grants. And for folks who don't know, that's, especially at that time, that's a lot of money. The NIH funds your research. That's basically how you sink or swim in academia. And after being arrested for prostitution, she claimed she was being framed. Now, Palfrey, like Palfrey, Britain knew names of people in positions of power who were engaged in prostitution, and she had claimed her clients included police, lawyers, and judges. And there was a belief that she may threaten to release some of these names. And shortly thereafter, she was found hanged just before her case went to trial.
The one convicted of running a high-end prostitution ring in Washington has been found dead in Florida, apparently from suicide. A body that police believe is Deborah Jean Palfrey was found in a shed near her mother's mobile home in Tarpon Springs, Florida, near Tampa. Police say there was a suicide note, but are not releasing what it said.
And this was seen as really suspicious. Did she actually commit suicide and hang herself, or was she murdered? But the reason why that fits in with the DC Madam case, not just because she was an employee, Palfrey was famously defiant. She really knew she was one of the early figures who knew how to use the internet. And so she took to the internet, kind of jumping over legacy media in a lot of cases to speak about her innocence. And after Brandy Britten's death, Palfrey told the media, quote, "I guess I'm made of something that Britton wasn't made of." She even wrote to the prosecutor promising she wouldn't kill herself. She was very concerned about noting that there's no way she would commit suicide. And despite her public resolve, Palfrey was found hanged in a shed outside of her mother's home just 2 weeks after her conviction. She left a suicide note calling her predicament a modern-day lynching and stating that there was no other exit strategy. The DC Madam case is, directly connected to kind of Epstein under a couple of ways. First, Palfrey had names she could leverage to get herself out of jail. So even if she was guilty of the crimes and sent to jail, she could theoretically use those names to get herself out. She also, was found supposedly committing suicide, which a lot of people find hard to believe given her public statements. And just like kind of the Epstein case, even though Palfrey had supposedly had all the list of high powerful officials, they were never released. And that was basically the story of Epstein, right, until this recent effort by Congress. And obviously it's fits similar to the death of Craig Spence. Let me just add one more thing to this before I get your guys' take on it. So I mentioned at the beginning of the show that I searched for all these scandals in the Epstein files, and not all the files have been released, so maybe more will come out. And all I found were news articles. This is the one exception, actually. There's an interesting email in here, and it doesn't say who it's from or who it's to. So that already kind of makes this suspicious. But I thought it was interesting to read. And it says, a line of the email says, "I keep thinking that someone is going to be contacting me about Jeffrey Epstein case and the connection between his cause of death, or his case, his death, and that of Janine Palfrey, the DC Madam, and her death, which I also believed was a murder, and yet no one is. Maybe what's obvious to me isn't so obvious to other people. So I thought I'd reach out to you and make contact now that you've gotten a hold of Miss Maxwell." And Ghislaine Maxwell was the only person who's gone down for Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking. The letter continues, "Palfrey tried desperately to get the names of her clients published in her lawsuit because her case was not what it appeared to be. Not according to the story she told me, anyhow, as someone who spoke to her almost daily for the last couple of years of her life and up to just a few hours before she was found dead. I believe she was murdered because of the great effort many were putting forth to keep the names in her phone logs quiet, as well as she was trying to say about her case that was being concealed in the media despite all the noise." And the letter goes on like that for a lot more. We don't know who the letter's from. Like I said, this could be some, maybe person with mental issues who thinks they knew Palfrey and made this all up. But all the names are redacted on it. So what do you guys make of the story and the Epstein connection here?
Yeah, either way.
I think I went to the actual DOJ document, and I think that towards the very end in the email, the emailer says, "There's a lot more to this story, Ms. Strauss." And I think Miss Strauss is referring to Audrey Strauss, who is the acting U.S. attorney for who oversaw the case against Ghislaine Maxwell. And so I think that was my understanding, was that this email was from some well, and then it says like sex workers anonymous as like, but it doesn't have the email address. But there, so I'm wondering if it was someone who was involved in these in either the DC Madam case, or as one of the girls, or in or yeah, somehow is in these inner circles, in these sort of sex circles, I guess. But that was, yeah. So it is a really interesting email, though, and it it honestly made me think a lot about why the internet is so caught up with, like can't let go of these stories. And it's because there there are these patterns, these like whether it's bodies that are just popping up, or these narratives that don't quite totally line up or check out. And as the the population, the general public, we're hearing this and we're being told that the patterns that you're noticing are, it's just conspiracy theory. It's like the mainstream media or the government is just basically saying, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? And I think that just it makes us, at least for myself, it makes me want to dig deeper. And it doesn't I think it just it adds fuel to the fire in a sense. And then yeah, the commonality of the DC Madams list being in ABC's hands, and ABC deciding not to go through with it, brings back the that hot mic moment with Amy Robach, who was saying, "Oh, we had all this, I had the whole story on Jeffrey Epstein, but ABC, they nixed it because we wanted to cover the royal wedding and former Prince Andrew."
The artist formerly known as Prince Andrew.
Yes,
But,
the artist formerly known as Prince Andrew, now just
to your point,
Randy
Dickey.
Andy or whatever.
Dickey, to your point, just for folks who don't know, and Amy Robach worked for ABC at the time, so she was claiming she had put together the Epstein story and ABC killed it. But go ahead.
Yeah, I just I think it just shows that the the fallout, there's a great capacity for handling the fallout, and it involves complicity from the government, the mainstream media, and they're not necessarily coordinating directly to each other. There's not some decree that's put out. I mean, maybe there is, but I doubt there's a smoking gun for that. But I think it's just it's become the default. It's almost it's hearkening back to what we were speaking about, where there's that sort of censoring that happens, where if you want access to power, you just know subconsciously almost to not challenge, not to not ask tough questions and not to probe deeper and to let it go. And yeah, I that's what I was thinking a lot about. And yeah, it's just it's hard not to conclusions that this
Yeah, just
Good,
yeah,
Sydney.
just this like idea that like ABC News could determine that like none of the names were newsworthy enough, or that it just like reminds me that people use relevance as almost like a protective filter, like saying that something isn't relevant enough. It reminds me a lot of the most recent thing that happened. I feel like week ago, 2 weeks ago, was CCOT, how they said that it wasn't this like 60 Minutes was supposed to do an entire segment titled on CCOT. And they essentially cut the entire segment, citing that wasn't like ready for air. And I think that this reminds me of this idea that like we are constantly being told that things aren't like ready, or that they're essentially aren't relevant enough for us. But that determination is based on, again, people who have power or who are in power. And I think that as a citizen or as someone who consumes news, that can become very frustrating, because obviously we would like to be a process of what we would determine is relevant. And so it is interesting to kind of watch that take place. And then I think also in relationship to things like reoccurring patterns of deaths or suicide, I think what becomes almost scarier about those is how death kind of is function as like an end of the discovery and like a freeze of this narrative rather than an extension of investigation or something that people continue to look into. It's kind of like this seal, if you will, of like, oh, now we don't need to talk about this anymore because this chapter has been closed. And I think that's what's really terrifying about something like that, is the idea that something like a death happening is what is essentially like a closing point for some of these stories.
Yeah, and I think that's well said. I'm glad you brought the CCOT thing, and Dickey was bringing up the memorandums from the top for news media, because it's so interesting to me that for years, we brought up Chomsky earlier, but folks, Chomsky and all of his kind of intellectual descendants have often talked about how the power and money behind news media dictates the type of coverage. And we were always dismissed by journalists as being, sort of conspiracy theorists. But now, like, everybody in the media admits that when, like, Larry Ellison takes over CBS, they're like, oh, a Trump loyalist is taking over a platform. It's going to affect the coverage. It's like, so when people who you don't like do it, it affects the coverage. When people you like own it, it doesn't affect the coverage. And these memorandums from the top, I mean, they happen all the time in the forms of like business memos. Like, remember, like New York Times talked about like not using the word genocide in terms of Gaza, told all its reporters it couldn't use that. And it's not even necessarily that new. Like back in the day, they had memos that you had to ask a woman you interviewed if she was Miss or Mrs., and that had to be in the Times. Or they had memos refusing to cover anything in the gay community back in the day as well. And I had I won't say which news outlet, but one journalist told me off the record about how there were straight stories coming down from like the top regarding Israel Gaza that were then put into like local coverage, and they weren't allowed to like ask any follow-up questions for those stories. So there are, it does happen both indirectly, as we were talking about, and directly. Not all the time, not for every story, not at every outlet. But the idea that it never happens is simply not true. And I want to get to kind of our final scandal here, which I have to admit, this is one that people always brought up to me, but I don't know. Maybe because it was centered on someone from France that I didn't like see the US connection as much. But let's talk about this one. This is called the Brunel Epstein pipeline, or the pageant paradox. And Jean-Luc Brunel is the focus of this one. And it focuses on a high-powered French modeling scout who founded MC2 Model Management, an agency funded with a $1 million investment from Jeffrey Epstein. Now, Brunel was a primary supplier, supposedly, in the Epstein network. Virginia Gouffre alleged in court filings that Brunel specialized in bringing young women to the U.S. on modeling visas, only to farm out to Epstein and his powerful friends. Virginia Gouffre, of course, was one of the most public accusers of Epstein, and we lost her a handful of years ago. Epstein reportedly bragged that he had slept with over 1,000 of Brunel's girls. And the pageant modeling link is an interesting one. Brunel's career was built on the discovery of supermodels, and some very famous ones too, who I'll leave out because I don't want to necessarily get them tied up in all this. That's for other people to do. But he operated in a world where beauty was a commodity, and pageants or scouting trips served as the ultimate recruitment grounds for vulnerable teenagers. And there's been a long history of inspecting like these young pageants, and it's noteworthy that our president here, President Donald Trump, formerly owned one as well. During his ownership of the Miss Universe and Miss Teen USA pageants, Trump notoriously bragged on the Howard Stern show about his ability to walk into dressing rooms while contestants were naked. He stated, quote, "I'm allowed to go in because I'm the owner of the pageant, and therefore I'm inspecting it."
I mean, some of these foreign girls, Mr. Trump, in my country, we say hello with vagina. And,
well, you could also say, as the owner of the pageant, it's your obligation to do that.
So you have done that. Now,
I'll tell you the funniest is that I'll go backstage before a show.
Yes.
And everyone's getting dressed and ready and everything else. And, no men are anywhere. and I'm allowed to go in because I'm the owner of the pageant, and therefore I'm inspecting it. I'm inspecting. I want to make sure that
You're like a
everything is
doctor.
good.
You're there.
Yeah, the dress. Is everyone okay? They're standing there with no clothes. Is everybody okay? And you see these incredible looking women, and so I sort of get away with things like that.
Well, many of the contestants were adults. The Miss Teen USA franchise included girls who were, as young as 15. In 2016, several former contestants from the 1997 Miss Teen pageant corroborated that Trump had entered their dressing room while they were in various stages of undress. And these pageants have long been accused of being kind of cover for men like Epstein and Brunel to scout and groom young girls or children. And when we, talk about these are kind of two of the big names, Brunel and Epstein, and obviously Trump is a third one in there. But there have been other scandals as well. So the Miss Venezuela model scandal, it was one that existed as well. It's probably one of the most highly documented examples. Basically, it was a global powerhouse in coming out of Venezuela, and it ended up to all these reports on academic studies about the dark underbelly of these pageants, because they would dictate plastic surgery, and they would provide funding in exchange for sexual favors, and it created this sort of cult of debt bondage. And there were other scandals in 2014, like the Miss Cartiega scandal, and there were other investigations of other pageants as well, and you can find a lot of those online. But basically, there's a long history of sort of pageants being connected to this sexual exploitation. And I want to get your guys' take on this, but the last kind of a connection to Epstein is the death of Jean-Luc Brunel in February of 2022, about 3 years after Epstein died. And after being arrested in France for the rape of minors and sex trafficking, the 75-year-old Brunel was found hanged in his cell.
He was a close confidant of convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein and a former French modeling agent facing charges of his own. Tonight, Jean-Luc Brunel is dead, found in his Paris prison cell hanged with his bed sheets, according to the Paris prosecutor's office. Authorities believe the 75-year-old died by suicide. It comes less than 3 years after Epstein was found dead in a Manhattan prison under similar circumstances. His death has been ruled a suicide. Brunel was awaiting trial after several former models accused him of rape and sexual harassment when they were minors.
In a Paris prison. His death occurred exactly as his case was gaining momentum, mirroring the death of Jeffrey Epstein in 2019 and the DC Madam in 2008. With Brunel dead, the French criminal case is effectively closed. He took with him the names of friends he had supposedly farmed girls out to for decades. What do you guys make of this one?
This doesn't ring a bell at all. Just kidding.
I know, it's this sad, terrible, disgusting truth that this is, it just makes me think of that power corrupts people, and there's that you start seeing yourself as separate and fundamentally different and better than other people, where you a human life becomes meaningless and disposable and expendable, and that their quality of life isn't as important as yours, and you can do whatever you want and face no consequences. That's kind of, owning a modeling agency is a great way to fuel that habit of yours, or that tendency.
Yeah, and I would say that if we want any facade of living in a free society, and you guys talked about this in the last segment, the names are already out there. So there are witnesses, there are ways to corroborate this. Journalists could be doing the work to get more of this information out there, but they seemingly leave these stories when the trial is off the table, right? Like the Epstein is dead, the Brunel is dead, the Spence is dead. But there's still a litany of victims who have an experience. And just because they're not going to be brought to court doesn't mean that there's not evidence out there to paint a picture of what happened here. There's a list of names from the DC Madam, or even, from supposedly Vinson's catalog of folks, certainly Epstein's names. Yeah, there may not be a list, Pam Bondi, but collectively through the documents and witnesses, there are those. So I think it's important to get that information out there, even if all these stories are not connected, or that the narrative about the blackmail honeypot is false. There's still some legitimacy to these stories. And that's what I hope people will take away from listening to today's episode. And I want to thank you, detoxers, for tuning in to the Disinfo Detox. Please make sure to like, follow, and subscribe. If you can, go to Patreon or Substack. For as low as $5 a month, you can support this show so we can keep bringing you this great content. I want to thank my guests, our resident philosopher, Dickey, and Sydney Sullivan, for coming on the Disinfo Detox.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, detoxers. Be
All right,
well.
thank you. Keep detoxing.